Workers in Ireland have been hammered by austerity. The Socialist Party in Ireland has helped build a mass movement against the hated water charges, advocating non-payment. The charges are now all but beaten, although the EU says the Irish government must press ahead with water charges and austerity. In 2014, our penultimate speaker was propelled to the Irish Parliament as an anti-austerity fighter, the same day as a massive protest against the water charges, calling for non-payment of that austerity attack. He now faces trial and imprisonment, along with 17 others, for a protest against the now ousted Labour Deputy Prime Minister 2 years ago. And Paul wanted me to mention that today is the 5th anniversary of his release from Israeli prison. Please show your appreciation for Paul Murphy.
You weren't meant to mention the fact that I asked you to say it, you know. It's much better if it comes from you than from me. Anyway, next Tuesday will be the 2nd anniversary of what is now a defining protest in Irish politics, and what I think will become a protest that is known to activists all around the world. Joan Burton, the Deputy Prime Minister, former, and then leader of the Labour Party, again former, came to Jobestown, which is a working class community in Tala in the constituency that I represent. Obviously about a month after the by-election victory on October the 11th and the eruption of the anti-water charges protest. And it was a signifying of the mass working class revolt that was taking place at that stage that she was met by a spontaneous protest. Over 500 people, the crowd grew and grew, and it's just like we say about 1916 in Ireland, that everyone says they were in the GPO in 1916. Everybody in Tala that you meet says they were there at the protest. And despite the presence of close to 100 police, 2 police helicopters, there were a number of sit-down protests and a slow march that resulted in Joan Burton's car being delayed for 2.5 hours. In the 2 years since then, politics has been turned upside down in Ireland. Water charges have been suspended. All the parties are forced to say that they're against the privatisation of water, all of them voting in the Parliament last week in favour of a referendum, which they'll still try and stop, but a referendum to stop privatisation of water. And most ludicrously, Joan Burton joining a protest against water privatisation last Wednesday at the Parliament. And the establishment parties have been dealt an historic blow. In the general election, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael reduced to below 50% from highs of 80, 90% in the past, and the Labour Party smashed from 37 seats in the Parliament to 7. And alongside that, the rise of the left, most recently reflected in the latest opinion poll, which puts the Anti-Austerity Alliance People Before Profit on 9% against the Labour Party on 5% and Sinn Féin on 13%. And all of that happened because of that working class revolt from below. The protests of hundreds of thousands of people, the street meetings, the community organisation to stop water meters, and most importantly, the non-payment, which saw 73% of people refuse to pay the final bills for the water charges. And Jobestown and the protest have become symbolic of that working class revolt. Symbolic for us, for our class, but also from the point of view of the ruling class. Because it's where working class people demonstrated they weren't going to play the role allotted to them in capitalist democracy, of waiting in the long grass, voting once every 5 years for parties like the Labour Party that sell them out. Instead, they were going to express their power and their control over their own areas, and also associated with the rise of the left, because it's a key area where we won the by-election in October 11th, which transformed politics and opened up a huge space for the Socialist Party and the Anti-Austerity Alliance in particular. And it's for that reason that that protest is now the target of intense state repression. The purpose is to criminalise protest, to demonise the left, in particular the Socialist Party and Anti-Austerity Alliance, and most importantly, to send a message to people, this far and no further. You might have forced us back on the water charges, but don't think you can do the same on abortion rights, on the minimum wage, on people's strikes that are currently taking place for pay rises. You won't be able to defeat us again because we're going to criminalise your protest. The first victim in this state repression is a 17-year-old who joined the protest when he was 15, an activist against the water charges, not someone who just wandered by, a community activist against the water charges and austerity. And 2 weeks ago, he was found guilty. He wasn't found guilty of a road traffic offence, of blocking the road. He wasn't found guilty of a minor public order offence. He was found guilty of false imprisonment. And if you listen to the reasons that the judge gave for why he was guilty, he said that the young man sat in front of a car and encouraged others to sit down. He participated in a slow march. He momentarily stood in Joan Burton's way and asked her to talk to him. She incidentally used the slogan in the election saying, "Talk to Joan." Someone on social media added an asterisk, "Don't talk." And finally, he used a megaphone to chant, "No way, we won't pay." That's it. He's guilty of protesting, not guilty of kidnapping. And it would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. But it represents a massive broadening of the definition of false imprisonment to include most forms of effective protest. It's a serious threat to anybody who would seek to exercise their right to protest. To the 4 striking workers, in future, effective picket lines can be classed as false imprisonment if that logic is continued and that precedent is used. Abortion rights protesters who engage in a slow march, which delay some cars, can be criminalised. Anti-war activists who have a sit-down protest, they too can now be guilty of false imprisonment. It's a striking confirmation of the old union slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all. And the judge in the verdict, he gave an insight into the attitudes of the ruling class. He said, and I quote, "The assembly was not peaceful and was contrary to public order and morality, which means it did not attract the protection of the Constitution or the European Convention on Human Rights." So because the judge and the ruling class consider protesting against austerity to be immoral, well then your human rights, your right to protest, your right to peaceful assembly, they're out the window. And it's such an illustration of what Trotsky described as the chief function of official morality. He wrote, "The ruling class forces its ends upon society and habituates it into considering all those means which contradict its ends as immoral." So anything that challenges their right to rule, their right to profit, their right to repress is immoral. The 17-year-old was given a conditional discharge. So he kidnapped, supposedly, and now in fact, according to law, he kidnapped the Deputy Prime Minister. He was put on trial and he was found guilty of kidnapping the Deputy Prime Minister, and then he wasn't jailed. And they say there's no such thing as political policing, there's no such thing as political judging. But has a clear purpose, which is to establish the fact in people's minds, and in particular in a jury's mind for next April and other trials, that false imprisonment took place on that day. It's to prepare for convictions of 18 adults who will face trial next year and the following years. It's to prepare the ground to jail us for substantial sentences, and we can face up to life in prison for false imprisonment, and there'll be no conditional discharges outside of the Children's Court for this, according to the lawyers. To remove me as a TD, as an MP, because if they sentence me to 6 months or longer, we automatically lose the seat once our appeals are exhausted, and to criminalise protest. The first trial of the first group of adults, there's 7 of us, including me and 2 Socialist Party and Anti-Austerity Alliance councillors. The first group, the 7, begins on April 24th. The trial is going to last between 6 and 8 weeks. It'll be the biggest political trial in Ireland for decades, possibly in the history of the state. And it'll be class struggle in the courtroom. We have to build a campaign locally, in Tallaght, in Dublin South West, nationally across the country, and internationally, of an unprecedented scale. A defence campaign, a Jobstown not guilty, defend the right to protest campaign. In order to turn the tables on the ruling class and the state, to pit our morality against their morality, our right to protest against their state repression, our socialist policies against their austerity, and then to convince a jury that the real criminal on that day was Joan Burton and the Labour Party for betraying their own election promises to oppose water charges and austerity. And the people who protested against them, including the 17-year-old young man, are heroes in the view of our morality rather than criminals. If we build such a campaign, and that involves all of you, in unions, in tenants associations, in any organisation you're in, to raise these issues, seek to pass motions, raise awareness, join in on the international days of action, that will happen. But if we do build that kind of campaign, we can really make them rue the day that they decided to go after us and the right to protest in this way. Instead of becoming a moment where they strike blows against us, it can be a disaster from the point of view of the ruling class. And it can be a defining moment in the rebuilding of the working class movement, of broadening of consciousness about the role of the state, of the injustice that exists within capitalism, and the building of a mass, a working class, left and socialist movement. Because if we do that, to paraphrase the Scottish socialist John Maclean, we will then not be appearing in the courtroom as the accused, but as the accusers of their repression, of their austerity, and of what he accurately called their capitalism dripping with blood from head to foot. Thank you very much.